Welcome back to another episode of Master Asian Core. Today we are going to talk about workflow. Workflow? Really? Am I serious? Yes, workflow. So what specifically about workflow do we want to talk about? I think, for me, when I first started this journey, the first question I asked was, how does a developer work? Now, we are so used to the waterfall model where there's specific state that we go through, and then what we do is we try to automate the process. So then we take on tools, either TFS or whatever tools that you may use, it has its specific state flow. So what about Scrum? What about Agile? How do we do that? How we capture the information? So today we are going to talk about that. So let's take a look. Let's line them up first. So first of all, let's look at the events in Scrum. So in Scrum, we have the sprint. We have sprint planning, daily stand-up, sprint review, and retrospective. And then, of course, there's a activity that I like to separate out from sprint planning. I like to do backlog refinement as a separate activity outside of the rest of the events in Scrum. Now, if you look at those and you look at how things are described in terms of work, you can kind of figure out how the workflow should be. So what we want to do is we want to get a minimum workflow. Now, the goal here is, of course, going back to the Agile Manifesto, which is people and interactions over process and tools. Yes, we are talking about process here, but our process should mimic what our interactions look like. Before a team starts working on it, we have a user story, right? So a user story, let's take a look at the user story. So I'm going to put in drop now a user story here. Now for a user story, we would say, well, how did this user story progress, from all the way from here all the way to the end? We know along the way, there are a couple of things that we want to care about. So I'm going to drop this in here and say, well, let's take a look at that. So let's assume that they are, at the basic minimum, I know that a story, I'm going to put in as, we usually have a backlog, if I can spell. And from this backlog, we then, somehow the stories will go into in progress. And eventually, it will come out the other end where it's done, right? At the basic minimum, this is kind of probably what it will look like for a user story. So this is a sprint backlog. But you think about it, well, how do we work? How does developer work? How do we capture this information and use this process? So we need to organize ourselves. So our workflow should start somewhere where the story starts. So let's take a look at the story. The story starts somewhere here before it gets to our sprint backlog or before it gets into a backlog. So a product owner have an idea or got an information from a stakeholder or from a end user, something like that, and the story starts. So I would say there's something called, let's put this as orange, there's something called new, right? The first time the story is created in a backlog, I would say it's brand new. After that, what does the product owner has to do? The product owner has now to get the story ready to a point where it's good enough. Well, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to get good enough? Well, if you are practicing backlog refinement, which is kind of what I do and I recommend, that means you got to get a story good enough so that you can present to the team during backlog refinement. So how do you know the story is ready for backlog refinement? Well, if you have a list of things in your backlog, somehow, somewhere, you need to organize this backlog. So I would say the next state would be ready for refinement. So I can easily look at my backlog. I can see the ones that I, as a product, I'm still working on. I can also easily now filter the one that is ready for refinement, which means that here are the stories that I would want to bring in and show to my team. If you have your backlog ordered, the stuff on top should be ready for refinement. But it's nice to say if I somehow mark it that it's ready for refinement, it makes it a lot more easy for me to say, well, do I have enough stories for my team? One of the practices I highly recommend is to have about 3 sprints worth of stories that is ready in the backlog. Well, how do we get to that? So ideally, you want to get to this good mix, good cadence, or good number of stories that is ready to be pulled in. So one of the ways is, well, let's work on it. So as a product owner, you're now, maybe engaged in a Three Amigos conversation. You may be talking to your stakeholders, getting some information, talking to possibly an architect, a lead, to kind of get an idea of what the stories could be or look like, what's possible, what's not, some of the, feasibility in terms of UI and things like that. So we want it to be good enough for the product owner to show at backlog refinement. Once you got a story ready for backlog refinement, you go into your backlog refinement session and says, hey, team, here are the stories that I would like you to look at. So what do we do at backlog refinement? Well, at backlog refinement, the team looks at the story and then decide whether they have enough information. And if they do, if everything is good, they have acceptance criteria, the definition are done, they know what is needed to do the work. If all this is good, the last thing they probably want to do is put an estimate on it. So if it has the estimate, has all these things, it is sometimes called ready for sprint. So some companies, some groups practice what's called definition of ready. So if it meets definition of ready, that means it is good enough for the team to pick up to work on in a sprint. So ideally, I would want to denote this as ready for sprint. Now, however you want to call it ready, whatever that could be, to me, it is ready for sprint. That means this story has all the necessary information, the estimates, if you're practicing estimates, and it is ready for us to bring it into a sprint. Okay, so this helps us filter. Again, we're organizing our backlog, new, ready for refinement, and then ready for sprint. All right, so what then after ready for sprint? So during sprint planning, every 2 weeks, if that's how you practice it, you have this process, this event called sprint planning. In sprint planning, we're going to pull up the backlog and we'll look at the items that is ready for sprint. Now, we all know that the stuff on top should be ready for sprint, ideally. Okay? If it's not, if there's no way for you to denote that it is ready for sprint, you may get confused. You may have some, hey, guys, we haven't talked about this yet. Well, it's nice practice to have it marked as ready for sprint. So awesome. So once it's ready for sprint, what do? You then pull it into your sprint. Now, I don't need to denote anything with it other than we have a sprint. This is an event, and we're pulling it into the sprint. Usually, if you have a tool, we mark the story as the specific sprint, and that will be the amount of information that I need, that this story is assigned to a specific sprint. And that's how I would know. That's how I would know that this story has been committed by the team. I would say sometimes I see people doing this. They will come in and say, well, it is committed. And I will argue that you probably don't need it. It's extra information. The fact that the story has been assigned to a sprint will mean that it's committed. So it all depends on how you practice it. Now, any stories that doesn't have a sprint, in my mind, hasn't been committed. So I will not commit to anything. Okay? So if you have the habit of practicing where you're going ahead and trying to place stories in sprints, and trying to put it into 6 sprints roadmap, for example, if you're practicing SAFe, then you maybe want to have something that's called committed. For me, I would say it is really not needed because too far out, I really don't want to do that. It's kind of, to me, it's a waste. It's like the concept of the fog. Anything is too far away, we really don't know. So you don't have to do that. So to me, this is a step that I don't practice. So, okay, so the team has it. The team has committed to it. So what next? Well, I would say once the team pick it up and work on it, it will be in progress. In progress means that I'm working on it. It will include making sure I've got my testing done. It will include my attention when my code review is done. All those things is done, right? Now, once it's done, I need to show it to my product owner and have my product owner accept the story. So I would say the next thing I would like to see at the minimum would be after it's been accepted. So I would say it's done, right? It has met the definition done. It is done. So I would say it is done. At a basic minimum, I would say I would call it done. Now, I've seen companies and groups that practices something where it's ready for PO. Or you may have something in here that says ready for testing and things like that. I would say you don't need it. Now, I do see people who want to have it. Oftentimes, we're so used to this gated process where we're handing stuff off. So you may practice where you have a team in a separate QA team, which is not ideal. And if that's in your situation, then you may have to have a separate one called ready for testing or something like that. But I would not recommend it again. So I would say at the bare minimum, go with in progress. And I don't really care the in between, right? We really don't care. The only thing I care about is it done? Okay, is it done? Again, I would say you can have something called ready for PO, then we have the product owner accept it. Once the product accepts it, it changes it to done. So done is the state that I would say, okay, now it's done. That means it's ready to be shipped. So I will start counting my points at the end of my sprint, right? So that's kind of a way, I bank my points. Now I collect my points. Well, how many points did we accomplish during the sprint? Well, when things are done, and which is accepted by the product owner. These are also the stories that you will show during sprint review. And that will be it. At the bare minimum, all you need is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. All you need is 5 different states. You don't need any more than that. And if you look at that, it all lines up with Scrum. So some of you might say that, well, that's not reality. There is more to it than just this. Well, I would say that this is your bare minimum. Again, Scrum doesn't tell you this is the workflow. Scrum doesn't tell you this is the state. Scrum is a framework. Now, out of this framework, I would want to do the bare minimum. What we really care about is the people and interactions. And take that and say, well, how do we make that into something that is manageable and that we can use to manage our backlog and make it as easy as possible and still have value towards what we're trying to do. So don't overdo it, don't overthink it. Oftentimes when I start a brand new team, they struggle with this. They want to go in at, it's ready for testing, it's ready for code review, all these different things in there. I would argue, what value are we trying to do with all those extra steps? If you're trying to fix the communication issues, okay, cool. I would still say, I would push back and say, let's not do that. Can we not do that? Because the reality is that if those things are not done, it's not done. I have no value from my story. So avoid those. Now, I do understand that some of you out there, if you're working for a IT group, if you're an IT for a company, and your company is not doing software development, for example, you may have other processes that you have to follow. Now, that comes into play, right? For example, you have UAT. Well, where does UAT sit? Well, let's take a look at it. So the question is, where does UAT sit? Well, let's think about this. Where is UAT? So UAT is a process where we're trying to get our users to look at what we have delivered to accept the work. I say this is very old waterfall process. The reason why we need this process is because in waterfall, we get a big requirements up front, then we go away and come back after a long time to then show it to the users. Of course, the users is afraid of what we deliver because they haven't seen it for the longest time. If you're doing work every 2 weeks, this shouldn't be an issue. Anything that you tested in UAT should be discussed and put into your acceptance criteria. So we want to shift left, right? push it up early and make it into the story, so that way it's in the story itself, and the product owner can look at it and close it out. Now, if you still have to practice UAT, that's okay. All right. The question I have is, who is doing your UAT? Is your UAT done between the sprint? Done by the same team members that's doing work? The answer is usually no. Users are not part of the team. So in that case, I would say your UAT sits outside of your sprint. Okay, I would say it sits outside of your sprint. It doesn't sit in the sprint, it is outside of the sprints. So I will not count my story points because I'm done, right? I'll count my story points when I'm done, not after UAT. So I will not say UAT is needed here. Count it outside of it. Well, cool. If you have a UAT process, you probably have a specific release process that you do. Because you want to know all the stories that is ready for UAT, and you want to show it to the users at one time. Say, now go do a UAT, and you have 2 weeks to do UAT, for example. Once users accepted it, and now you say, oh, well, now these stories are ready for release. I would say yes, it is being practiced today. In my mind, it is an arcade process. This is where DevOps E ICT comes into play, which will help you tremendously. Okay, so for companies that are doing this, for companies that don't have a choice, you're still in this path, you don't have a choice, that's what you do. You have this extra process or extra steps outside of it. So even with that, I want to do a minimum state, right? For every story that we want to deliver, it should have value. Okay, every story then should have a UAT process, right? So what story is ready for UAT? Awesome. Every story that is done is ready for UAT. Cool. Now, what stories is ready to be released, which means it's past UAT? Well, I would call then a state called UAT to make it easy, so we know that it's the one that has UAT and means it's past UAT. So let's make it past UAT for some of you to make sure that we're saying the same thing. So it passed UAT. That's all you need. And then after that, then here's a list of stories as past UAT and is ready to release. So then the release group can take that and release the product. So these are 2 extra steps, I would say. I see it often in companies that are, not software companies, for example. They are, traditional companies, and IT is a function and a department that helps deliver the business value. So this is, to me, an arcade process. I think it's something we can get rid of. Again, when we count story points, I would say, from anytime we count story points is when it's done, not all the way through. Because guess what? It takes maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks to get to past UAT, and then you got to schedule a release. That doesn't count, right? To me, that doesn't help for us to figure out what is my capability and bandwidth of our sprint. So let's put it all back together, right? So a user story comes in, the product owner creates it, and it's in the state of the new. Then the product owner works on it and get it to the point where it is ready for refinement, and then it brings it into backlog refinement. So bringing it into the activity backlog refinement where the team works on it, and they're now ready for sprint. So then during sprint planning, the team pulls it into it, and it is part of the sprint. So it's a backlog in our sprint backlog, and it's part of the sprint. And then the team works on it, it goes into in progress, and from there, once the team finishes it, the product has accepted it, it goes into done. So only stories that are done, complete everything else, then we will show it at our sprint review. After that, the team has a retrospective, they talk about it, correct? So that's, in a sense, that is all this in a sprint itself. So once the sprint has completed, right, the story is now done, we will then say, okay, well, this story can now, it is done. We can send it to UAT, where UAT users acceptance happened, and then they pass UAT, and from there they move into release. So again, these 2 states, what I would say, extra state outside of the sprint. Now, if you want to put it into your sprint, if these 2 states is required in your sprints, that means you either have CI/CD in play where the process isn't long, and also the people that are doing testing, the people that are doing deployment is part of your team. Now, if your team members are not the one doing deployment, if you have a separate team that's doing release, then it should not be, okay? You should not be. Done, doesn't have to include all these things. Done is only the things that your team can do. Okay? Ideally, I don't want these two things. Ideally, I don't need this. When I get to done, that means I'm ready to be released already. So that's at the minimum, that's all I want to do. Okay? So if you look at it, this is what I would say a bare minimum state workflow. So new, ready for refinement, ready for sprint, in progress, and done. So folks, that's the 5 minimum state. That's all you need. We want our tools, we want our process to mimic our interactions. Remember, it's people interactions. So use the minimum states that you need. So folks, I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions or comments, put it in there below and I will answer them. Thank you. Bye.